kia ora koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki te manatu hauora. Welcome again, a small but perfectly formed group here who are here for this session, which is focused really on treatments for Covid-19. With me today I've got Sarah Fitt, the Chief Executive of Pharmac, who will be making some comments later on. And on the screen, beaming in from Ōtautahi, Christchurch, I think, Dr. Ian Town, who's the Ministry's Chief Science Advisor. So Ian will also be contributing to the discussion. Now, it's great that we've got this opportunity just to give you an update on some of the key treatments that are emerging for COVID-19, but also the processes we've got in train to make sure we can ensure those treatments are available for New Zealanders as part of our overall response in a timely way. I'll talk a little bit about the MedSafe process to approve new treatments in due course. Ian's going to focus mostly on the different types of treatment and how they work and the place they will have. And Sarah will talk through the work Pharmac's been doing in quite unusual circumstances, a bit like our vaccine purchasing and trying to get ahead of the game here and putting in place advanced purchase arrangements. So that's where we'll go, and then we'll open up for questions. What I would say is that our daily statement will be out soon after the conclusion of this session with the case numbers and so on. What I can say is that our number today will be back under 100, which is very pleasing, and it again emphasises the impact that our public health measures, the restrictions under the alert level framework, and indeed now under the COVID protection framework, and of course our high and still increasing vaccination rates are happening and helping to control the outbreak in Auckland and to stamp out any cases that might have spread beyond the Auckland border. So our 7-day rolling average of cases at the moment is now 103 and compares with 145 last week and 187 the week before. Clearly this is incredibly encouraging. So saying, we're just a week into the COVID protection framework, and we'll want to be seeing what's happening in another week to ensure that those case numbers haven't started to increase again with the move to the framework. There's no reason to expect they will have, because during that 2 weeks our vaccination rates are not declining, they continue to increase, and importantly they are increasing in our Māori population at a faster rate than in other groups. So we're seeing Māori rates catch up and now sitting around 85 to 86% first vaccination rate for Māori. So now, indeed, nationwide, our coverage is sitting at around 89% full vaccination of the eligible population. We're still on track within the next few days. Probably before that Auckland boundary comes down, that our nationwide coverage rate will be 90% and that all Auckland DHBs will have 90% full vaccination, which is hugely encouraging. We're also continuing to make progress on issuing our vaccine passes. Over 3.3 million people have now downloaded a vaccine pass, and 4 million passes have been issued. That includes several hundred thousand for international travel people, hopefully, or being hopeful about the opportunity to perhaps travel next year. Internationally, I'm sure you're all aware that the pandemic continues to cause a lot of problems globally. We can see Europe now as the epicentre of the pandemic, with very high case numbers in most countries there. And if you look across a range of countries in Europe, many of them it would equate to New Zealand having between 3,000 to 4,000 cases a day and 10 to 20 deaths a day. So it's a very significant ongoing outbreak in Europe, and obviously related to them being in the winter season. So one of the things we're turning our minds to is how do we prepare for next winter, starting now. And our treatments and making sure we've got those available will be a key part of that. The US continues to lead globally in the wrong way in terms of number of cases and number of deaths per day, with Russia in second place. It's a sobering reminder of what can happen if this virus gets away in communities, even with relatively good vaccination rates. It's fast approaching 2 years since the coronavirus was first identified in Wuhan in China, and we have been living with the virus for that long, but we've seen remarkable improvements in public health responses in a number of countries, the availability of a range of highly effective and safe vaccines, and now very rapidly the development of treatments, in particular oral antivirals. Several countries have now approved the use of at least one of these, molnupiravir, one of the new treatments that Ian and Sarah will speak to, and we are also in the game there as well, and we'll come to that. So Sarah's going to, in due course, talk about Pharmac's pre-purchase agreements, but first I'd just like to hand over to Ian Town to talk about how the medicines are developed and also the role we'd expect them to play in our ongoing response. So Ian, over to you. A little bit of a delay there. His team. Luke, do you want to just check ins? Good to go? Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Ian. Can you just unmute? Thanks.
Well, kia ora tātou, everybody. Just having a little bit of technical challenge there, but thank you, Ashley, for the welcome, and it's great to be with you today, beaming in from Christchurch. So, key to our whole response really has been the importance of science throughout, and as Ashley has just mentioned, that led to the ability to have safe and effective vaccines available throughout the world, including New Zealand. And we're very well advanced with our vaccination program now, which is keeping people safe. And as you know from the data, those that are fully vaccinated are much less likely to suffer severe health outcomes from contracting COVID-19. Of course, therapeutics like vaccines are just part of that broad suite of responses that the government has been overseeing through the ministry and other agencies. We have made big advances in our diagnosis, in our contact tracing, and in all aspects of the response as we've learned and improved our processes. Critical amongst this, of course, is the ability to diagnose somebody with active COVID-19 quickly. And in that case, some of the new drugs, including the one that the Prime Minister announced, one of the Pfizer oral agents being available, the key thing is to be able to give that to the affected patient quite quickly. So the ability to have a rapid diagnosis, to then set in place protocols led almost certainly by our primary care colleagues to ensure that gets that treatment early. And as we know from all antiviral treatments, it's absolutely critical to get that into the system before the virus has a chance to replicate and infect other parts of the body. So very exciting and very much looking forward to talking a little bit later in the session about some of the other drugs that are currently available and being used in our hospitals that will be available for use in primary care. Back to you, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. And one of the things we've seen, and Ian might touch on this later, is in the Auckland outbreak, is the rate of admission to intensive care has declined through the outbreak. And this is in part because of the impact of vaccination. So vaccination meaning people who might otherwise have seriously got seriously unwell have had more moderate symptoms. But it does also reflect the learning that has gone on there and the early use of probably the most important drug, oxygen, but antivirals and other medications. So just briefly on the MedSafe approval process, which is important. MedSafe approves all medicines that are used in New Zealand, and that includes some that might be used but not necessarily publicly funded by Pharmac. And this is a prerequisite, and it's about making sure there is excellent data on both efficacy and safety of any new medication. And of course, when you're in a situation like we are at the moment, where these medicines are being developed very quickly and tested on relatively small populations, it's very important we maintain the rigour and the robustness of that process, because we want to ensure confidence of both clinicians and of people who are being offered or administered these medications. Very often, MedSafe needs to go back to the manufacturers to get further data once the initial information is submitted. and that can be quite an iterative process. What I would say is, through our assessment of the vaccinations, and this will include in our assessment of the pharmaceuticals, will continue in our assessment of pharmaceuticals, we won't be cutting any corners. So MedSafe will maintain its usual rigorous process. So if we think about also where New Zealand sits globally, very often we're small, we are small, and very often we receive the data after other countries. So for example, on molnupiravir, which the UK regulator has already approved last month, the company that makes that MSD has not yet submitted those data to us here in New Zealand. And clearly, MedSafe can't assess a medication and approve it unless they have all that data. So we are, in the first instance, at the behest of those manufacturers supplying it. That doesn't mean we sit back passively waiting for it. We are in active discussion with them. So we also have in place, after MedSafe, then a technical advisory group that provides further advice to us on whether and how those medications might be used as part of our overall response. And then I'm going to hand back to you to talk a little bit more about that, and also some of the other medicines that are already being used or that might be on the horizon.
Thanks, Ian. Just back to you.
Do you want to message him? Yep. Okay. I hope everyone else can hear me better than Ian seems to be able to.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Ashley, for passing back to me. So you mentioned the Therapeutics Technical Advisory Group, one of several groups that we've set up at the Ministry to help us with external advice on different aspects of the response. So Dr. Nigel Raymond, who's an infectious diseases physician in Wellington, is the chair of our group. We're very lucky to have some experienced clinicians from Auckland, including Dr. Chris Hopkins, who has actually worked in the UK and made a major contribution to the treatment of people in hospital and in ICU. We're also very lucky to have Jessica Keeper, who's a general practitioner from Paora, Tonga, and Dr. Sami, who's a resident medical officer in Northland. So we've got some really good people from around the sector involved. One of the things I just wanted to say around the antivirals is it's a tricky space. Antivirals are much harder to develop and test and bring into practice than what we know more commonly, of course, antibiotics. Antibiotics target the bacteria itself and have much impact on the rest of the body. Antivirals are interfering with machinery in the cell that the virus actually needs to replicate itself and cause further problems for our health and well-being, particularly in the lungs. So we've got to be a little bit careful when we're designing these drugs to make sure that they don't have unintended consequences, yet still have the benefit of attacking the virus and stopping it replicating. Some good examples of that, of course, have been an HIV infection, where we now expect people contracting HIV with a cocktail of drugs to have a much more normal life than they may have done in the early days. One of the problems with these drugs is that the viruses develop resistance to these drugs very quickly. And so we need to be very alert to the fact that sometimes the drug design needs to change to keep pace with the virus itself. So when we think about how these drugs are actually working in the body, there's two things that we are using therapeutics for. The first is to damp down the immune response. So these are drugs that are mainly used in more severe cases for people that end up in the intensive care unit. This is where one of the first drugs to show benefit, dexamethasone, is now being widely used throughout the world. And in fact, a number of New Zealand doctors contributed to the study that showed when given to people that were deteriorating in hospital, dexamethasone could shut down that intensive immune response and lead to better outcomes for patients. And that's a similar story for tocilizumab, which we've been using in ICU now for quite some time. This is a drug that has often been used as well for rheumatoid arthritis, and it's a drug that tends to dampen down the immune response. So we've had access to that with excellent support from our colleagues at Pharmac to get extra supplies and make those available to our doctors in ICUs. The third drug that's been used in our intensive care environment is remdesivir. Now this actually is a specific antiviral drug. A bit like Tamiflu, which we've had some experience with in terms of managing people with influenza, the effects of remdesivir have been a little lukewarm, is one of the descriptions I've read recently. So this is a drug that has been shown to help patients who are recovering from COVID-19, and what it does, it tends to improve the recovery, the speed of recovery, probably by reducing the spread of the virus within the lungs themselves. So again, a good example of how these drugs can help the more severe cases. What's exciting, of course, and this is where some of the new oral agents are coming to the fore, is the ability to affect the progress of the disease in those who have recently caught it. And that's why a number of these oral agents that Dr. Bloomfield has mentioned are showing great promise. So if we can have a drug that's made available to someone with a recent diagnosis of COVID-19, then we're able to perhaps slow the progression of the condition and prevent them needing more intensive medical care or even ending up in hospital. So those are things that are very exciting. The other one is another result of really exciting science, and that's Ronapreve, the specific dual monoclonal antibodies which target the virus exactly like the vaccine does. So these are drugs that complement the effect of vaccination by a very specific target on the virus, that spike protein that we've heard so much about, and help the body identify that as a foreign agent, a virus, and help the antibody response along with the vaccination. So these are very exciting things on the horizon. None of them are being used in New Zealand as yet, but we're looking forward, with the support of Pharmac and MedSafe, to having them available early next year. Just finally, before I finish and hand over to Sarah from Pharmac, there are a number of drugs you've asked us about previously which are not being used for the treatment of COVID-19. One of those is ivermectin, which you've probably heard has been touted as having some benefits. The research data simply doesn't show that that drug is effective, and it can have some pretty nasty side effects, so we're certainly not recommending that. And one of the other ones early on was hydroxychloroquine, as you recall. This was actually subject to a number of very large clinical trials and was shown to have no benefit at all. So that again just emphasises how important it is that we take a rigorous approach to the evaluation of these drugs, that we undertake proper clinical trials and safety assessments before we introduce them for use in patients in New Zealand. Thanks very much, and I think perhaps Ashley, it's over to Sarah now from Pharmac. Kia ora.
It is Sarah.
Kia ora, thank you. Thank you, Ian. So Pharmac has been working to support the COVID response for the last couple of years, working with many across the sector, particularly to ensure our ongoing supply of medicines and devices. We've had significant challenges around global supply chain. The other key part of work is our work around securing a portfolio of COVID treatments, and we've been doing that for some time. And for those treatments, we're actually using funding from the government's COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund. So it's important to note these medicines aren't being funded from our normal budget for medicines. Of course, as we know, vaccinations are still the first and best line of defence against COVID-19. However, we wanted to make sure that New Zealanders who are unwell with COVID-19 had access to the new treatments being developed as soon as possible. So as Ashley mentioned earlier, we're working quite differently. We've been proactively engaging with suppliers and negotiating advanced purchase agreements. And for us, this is quite different. Often the evidence is quite limited, the trials are at quite an early stage. But because there's such a high demand for these medicines, we need to be sure that we can secure treatment for New Zealand. So we're securing these advanced purchase agreements, but they're all still subject to that MedSafe approval before the final agreement is made and the delivery is made. So to help us make these decisions on which treatments to fund, we also have set up an advisory group, and our advisory group focuses very much on the medicines, but we have a number of members of the committee who are also on the ministry group as well. So there's good coordination between those two groups, and as well as members from our PTAC and our other subcommittees. So they're very carefully looking at all the evidence that we've got and also working on the access criteria for these medicines. But of course the access criteria are also going to be determined by how much stock and supply we can get. And as I said, we're working very closely with the Ministry of Science and Technical Advisory Group and the Therapeutics Advisory Group as well. So as Ian has mentioned, so far we've approved funding for tocilizumab and remdesivir, which are already being used in our hospitals along with the steroids, dexamethasone and budesonide. We've also secured stock of baricitinib, which is, as Ian mentioned, a medicine for rheumatoid arthritis. But because we've had some issues with the tocilizumab, this is a backup which we've secured. And as we've said, we've got advanced purchase agreements for the Ronapreve, molnupiravir and the oral Pfizer antiviral treatment. So that brings our suite of treatments secured so far to 6. 3 of them are already in use in the hospitals. 3 of them are subject to MedSafe approval, and we're hoping to secure stock of those next year. And we're continuing to work with other suppliers because there are a number of other agents available. So we're continuing to work to, as I said, have that wide portfolio of treatments available. So thank you. I'll hand you back to Ashley.
Thanks, Sarah. Just happy to close things off there. Obviously, treatments are going to play an important role in our ongoing response to the pandemic. I want to just acknowledge Sarah and her team for the work they have done, and she mentioned it at the start, but one of the key challenges has actually been securing enough supply of the drugs we're already using and no work, because they're in huge demand globally. I think your team's done an excellent job of keeping us supplied there and being looking ahead over the horizon at what's coming and securing those medications for New Zealanders. So happy to open up to questions. We'll try to involve Ian. I'm hoping that the fibre cable between here and Ōtautahi allows us to do so in a timely way. But open for questions. Kia ora.
Does any research, this might be totally out of the span of things, but does any research suggest that any of these drugs could potentially lower the risk of long-haul COVID? Or can patients benefit somehow who have long-haul COVID or who have the risk of long COVID? Right,
so I could perhaps make a comment, and Sarah may have something to say, and Ian, once he gets the question at his end. So yes, I mean, first of all, let's be clear, long COVID is a thing, and an increasing number of studies show that a good proportion of people, and in some it's suggesting around 30%, have still got residual symptoms between 3 and 6 months after their acute infection. Likewise, there was a study published just in the last couple of weeks where people were followed up with MRI scans down the road from when they had their acute infections, and showed actually some residual damage to their hearts, which is an area, so that myocarditis, which we know is actually relatively common, even if it doesn't produce symptoms in COVID infection. What I would say is, and Ian will correct me if I'm wrong, is generally the more severe someone's symptoms and the more severe their illness, the more likely they are to have residual symptoms. And so by particularly being able to treat someone early to stop what might be mild disease progressing to more severe infection and more severe disease is likely to reduce their risk that they will have at least long ongoing symptoms that would affect their daily lives. Sarah, did you have any insights there?
I haven't seen any specific evidence around that, and I guess, of course, the other important thing is that not a lot of people have received these treatments yet, so it's probably a little bit early to see that effect. But as Ashley said, obviously, the less severe your initial disease, the less chance you have of developing that ongoing long COVID.
Any comment from you, Ian, on that question? we'll come back to Ian, our correspondent in Christchurch. Yes, over here.
I was going to ask about how some of these antiviral pills will work in practice. Some of the overseas that might lead to the prescriptions and going to the pharmacy. Is that what you see for, I think, for the Pfizer antiviral potentially? And I guess how significant will that step change be for treating COVID?
Yeah, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so I think the advantage of the two antivirals are tablet form, so that certainly does make the potential to administer in the community a lot easier because it's a 5-day course. The Ronapreve has to be given intravenously or by subcutaneous injection, so that's going to be a little bit harder. But certainly the oral treatments should be able to be given in the community. We're still working with the team here, developing how that will actually be delivered to patients, because obviously a patient with COVID, you're not going to want them to be going to a pharmacy, so we'll need to work out how to manage that. I think the other important thing is that for both of those medicines, it's important that you start treatment quite early. So again, that's going to need to line up with what's happening around testing. So there's many people working on how we're going to actually get these treatments to patients who need it. But certainly having two oral treatments does certainly make things a lot easier.
I think in the bigger picture, having treatment studies available, is that sort of the next step in not normalising COVID, but just having COVID as like similar to other viruses that we have in terms of treatments?
Well, I think vaccination is still probably the most desirable, but this does give an option for people who haven't been vaccinated or maybe are immunocompromised and don't mount a reaction to the vaccine, because I think they're an important group as well where these treatments will be useful.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And I mean, just to reiterate that point, the significance of the vaccines we have is hard to overstate. If you think about, there's no vaccine against the viruses that cause the common cold. And even our vaccines against influenza each year, the efficacy varies between sort of 40 and 60%, 60% on a good year. And yet we've got vaccines that were developed so impressively quickly, and we're seeing the benefits of those with efficacy against hospitalisation, severe disease and death of well over 90%. And early, very early, but encouraging news from Pfizer a couple of days ago. I'm surprised no one's asked about yet. One small study, but encouraging that there does seem to be, at least in the lab from this small study, efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine against the Omicron variant, with the proviso that it's that the 3 doses, the booster dose, does seem to make the difference. And of course we've embarked on our booster campaign now already, so we'll be in a great position if or when Omicron crosses our borders.
On
Please.
that note, I suppose that third dose being kind of the key, most important aspect in the Omicron fight. Do you see, my question is also on the kind of long-term use of these antiviral treatments. How much of a role is it going to be? You say you can't overstate the importance of vaccines. So on maybe a percentage scale, how much are we going to see sort of reliance on these antiviral drugs through winter if we can't get that booster rolled out soon enough, or other vaccines as well?
So, just on the booster program, and in a way, the timing for us, because of when most people in New Zealand had their second dose, the timing for us is going to work quite well at that 6-month interval for the booster. We know the time we really want people to have that high level of protection is through winter, and you can see this in Europe. And so we've started already about 450,000 people eligible this side of Christmas, and then that will flow through into the new year. So we'll be going into winter if people, and we are encouraging, and we will be making sure everybody has the opportunity to get that booster as we lead into winter. So that's, I think, great from a timing perspective. And again, the treatments will be a part of our sweep of things. But the key thing is the role that the vaccination plays in just stopping people getting seriously unwell, requiring hospitalisation and or requiring ICU care. And the oral antivirals, the new ones, are designed for people who might be at risk of a bad outcome because of pre-existing conditions or age. And even if they're fully vaccinated, there will be some quite clear guidance around who those people are who might still benefit in addition to vaccination, and especially during winter, when sometimes people might be exposed to other respiratory pathogens, and so they could have a concurrent other respiratory illness that might make symptoms worse and put them at more risk.
You spoke about the fact that a lot of this evidence is still being gathered, and possibly some of these treatments were available but not necessarily for COVID. How much of a difference would these antiviral treatments have made if they were available, say, 6 months ago? Is there any way to
I think we've done incredibly well with our, numbers of admissions to hospitals and numbers of patients in ITU. The treatments for the sicker patients we have had all along. So really, these new treatments that are coming are for use much earlier in the disease. So I think we've been able to access the tocilizumab, the remdesivir, all the way through since the evidence became available, and obviously dexamethasone. I mean, that's an old medicine that's been around for a long time. So I think from that treatment of the sicker patients, we've had the treatments available. It's really, as Ashley says, going into next year with winter and being able to treat people earlier on to stop them going into hospital. I think that's going to be the advantage next year.
Yeah, it will be really important. I mean, still the key thing to protect people is keeping the number of cases low, stopping people getting infected or being exposed to the risk of being infected in the first place. I was reflecting on this a couple of days ago. We've had a very large Delta outbreak in Auckland, and it's extended beyond, I think, somewhere between 9,500 and 10,000 cases now. But we've had less deaths this year from COVID than we had last year, which is in part reflects the age demographic of the pandemic, of the outbreak in Auckland, but it also is a reflection of the impact of vaccination and the impact of the learning that has happened and the early treatment of people who do require hospital level care.
With these drugs that are available and will be made available, are there any restrictions on age with different people catching COVID and different age?
That's what we're working through at the moment with our advisors, because we want to make sure because the supply will be limited, we want to make sure that we're targeting to the right group. So obviously we'll be looking at things like comorbidities. Obviously people who are older are more at risk, but that's exactly what we'll be working through over the next few weeks, is actually defining those access criteria.
What's happening with the people who were already on these drugs for, say, rheumatoid arthritis, etc.?
Yeah, so that's been quite interesting. So tocilizumab, that we had about 400 patients on that for quite severe rheumatoid arthritis. Because of the global shortage of tocilizumab, we were able to switch them to another medicine, which is actually very good, and a lot of people were quite happy to change because this alternative is actually a tablet, whereas the tocilizumab is an infusion. So a lot of patients have changed over, but some people have stayed on the tocilizumab, and some people have found that tocilizumab doesn't work as well for them. So we've been able to keep supplies for those patients with rheumatoid arthritis who need it, but we've been able to then target the rest of the supply then to the COVID patients. But it has been a challenge, as Ashley said earlier. It's been a huge global supply issue because obviously the usage of these medicines went up significantly around the world. So far we've been able to maintain the supplies for both the non-COVID patients and the COVID patients that need it.
So the patients that have, say, rheumatoid arthritis and want to stay on
tocilizumab, yeah.
Are they able to
Yes,
do that?
yeah. So about 100 of the 400 patients have stayed on tocilizumab, either because they haven't tolerated the new treatment or they didn't want to change or it hasn't worked for them. But as I said, a large number of patients have switched, and the new treatment, as I said, is a bit easier because previously patients were having to go into hospital for an infusion. This means it's a tablet that they can take at home. So for some of them, it's actually been much more convenient.
Are patients being encouraged to switch to the alternative?
That's really a discussion that patients will have with their clinician. Obviously, we've been communicating with the clinicians, and that's a conversation that they can have. But yes, certainly the more patients that we've been able to switch, the more it frees up then supply for our COVID treatments, because tocilizumab has been very useful for patients particularly in that intensive care setting.
Just before we take the next question, I'm sure there are plenty. Did Ian want to intervene with anything, Luke? I know it's a bit hard for him, but yeah.
Kia ora, Ian, just providing you the opportunity if you had any comments to make at this stage. No problem.
Okay, that's great. He's watching with interest. He can provide feedback later on.
In terms of the preventative treatments, what's the time window where those are most effective in terms of from infection? How many days? What's the sort of window where those are actually showing results?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the trials are showing that probably within the onset of symptoms you need to start these treatments within 3 to 5 days. So the earlier the better, so that there is a window of 3 to 5 days for the treatment to start from the onset of symptoms. So that's where, as I said, that the people getting the testing when they've got symptoms is going to be really important, so we can make sure we can get the treatments to them quickly.
Yeah, this is an important point, and that will require people to get tested very promptly after the onset of symptoms. Then, of course, the turnaround of the test result, and then being able to get people started. And what we've seen in a number of our cases recently is a tendency for people to have waited often 7 to 10 days after the onset of symptoms before seeking care. Now, that hasn't more recently led to any more health, more serious illness for those people, although it does, of course, increase the chance they will have infected others. But to be able to benefit from these medications, we'll need to make sure we've got in place a system and just keep emphasising and make it easy for people to access that testing once the diagnosis is made, and if they fit the criteria, then they can get started on those medicines as quickly as possible.
Would a rapid antigen test result be sufficient to trigger, or would there be a possibility for someone with a positive result there to go on a preventative treatment while waiting for PCR results to come back, for example?
Not at this stage. However, what I would say is if it is a result from a rapid antigen test and someone was symptomatic, we would be aiming to get a rapid PCR test done. The challenge with the rapid PCR testing machines is they can only do low numbers, but if you've got someone where there's a very strong clinical suspicion, and if you've got a positive rapid antigen test, you can do a test on a rapid PCR and have that back in an hour or two, which then could mean early commencement of treatment. Yeah.
Given that short time frame, I guess what's been done for more isolated communities that have already experienced inequitable health outcomes?
Yes. This will have to be part of the planning, and in fact has been a key part of our planning for the care in the community model, which is now being sort of rolled out and stood up nationwide. So we will be able to use that model and the delivery of that model as the basis for being able to get these medications out, both testing and the medications out. And one of the things that's hugely exciting for someone who's been around the health sector for a long time is seeing our different information systems connecting up, so that the information can be made available wherever around testing results, people's clinical symptoms, and then linking to the pharmacy, and then working through about the delivery of those drugs out to where they may be needed.
On today's case numbers? Obviously, under 100 a week after the traffic light system came. Are we seeing? Would we be seeing the results of that now? And I guess, can you explain the feeling around that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're just cautiously optimistic. You won't find us ever more optimistic than cautiously optimistic, because otherwise it tends to invite problems. But I think you were seeing this downward trend, remembering also we haven't seen, if you think about the rest of the country, including Waikato, which has been Waikato's been an alert level 2 under the old system, and then in the orange level in the new framework, we haven't seen a big increase in cases. And what we're seeing in Auckland now is a very significant decline in case numbers. We will be looking to see that continue over this next week ahead of the Auckland boundary coming down. And the important thing here is that as low a number of cases as possible in Auckland is great ahead of that boundary opening, because it just simply means the pool of potential cases that might seed outside of Auckland will be much, much smaller. So I think this is a really encouraging development. And again, the impact that vaccination has had and the work that has gone in to get those vaccination rates up has just been outstanding.
On the matter of boundaries, Opotiki is the latest area to talk about blocking Auckland this summer. Is that going to be effective in preventing Delta's spread?
Well, what's effective will be three things. First of all, people being vaccinated. Secondly, the additional requirement that people are tested before they leave Auckland if they're not vaccinated. But arguably even more important than those two is that people who have symptoms, either not to travel or go out wherever they happen to be, but to stay at home and get a test and wait for the result of that test. So, the basics that have served us well right through the pandemic remain the really key things.
So we should be encouraging those key things, 3 key things, rather than talking about borders.
Certainly, we know there are communities that are concerned about the potential for infected people arriving in their communities and infecting others in their communities, so can understand the concern, and that's why you've seen the police working particularly with iwi and Te Tai Tokerau. I know there are communities outside of, in Opotiki and perhaps other parts of the Motu that are concerned as well. But again, the thing that is really encouraging about the COVID protection framework is that it has that strong emphasis on the use of vaccination certificates for people to be able to access the sorts of places where people might get infected, but based on the risk we know from the Auckland outbreak. So it's there to, I think the name is a good one, it's there to protect people vaccinated and unvaccinated.
You recommended that no traffic light until 5 to 11s were vaccinated. Are we putting those, or that group, or children at risk over however long that period is before that group can get vaccinated?
No, we're not. And one of the things I would say is that, on my part, I'm a big supporter of the new framework, and in fact, I could say sort of changed my mind on that because I recognise it actually provides a greater degree of protection than the alert level system did, because we now can get some protection from that high level of vaccination. So that would be the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is that the best way to protect 5 to 11s, of course, is for people for those who are eligible to be vaccinated, regardless of whether we're in an alert level framework or the traffic light system.
Being in the traffic, being in the traffic light system, has that really kind of shown you the pros of being in that system? Obviously, you were reluctant beforehand, but being in it and being amongst it, has that kind of changed? Is that what changed your mind?
It's really a combination of things. First of all, as we got closer to, and as the detail around the protection framework was finalised, and the clear protections it offers, including the use of vaccine passes, even if there was an area in green, vaccine passes would still be required for a number of things. But the second thing is just being hugely encouraging to see those high vaccination rates and the clear impact that is having on the outbreak. And so again, that's given certainly myself and my public health team here a high degree of confidence that the new framework is a great way for us to continue to protect populations, including those who either are not or cannot be vaccinated yet.
Just on advice and I guess rejecting of advice, it's come up this week a few times that the government has not necessarily followed the public health advice. Notably this morning reported that the government chose to go with a wider application of the sort of vaccination passport system rather than the public health advice for more high risk events. How does that feel to you that the government is choosing not to follow your advice?
Well, two comments here. First of all, they're not doing something that is the opposite of our advice. Very often you'll see they're actually just taking it further. So perhaps acting even more cautiously than our advice would be. But I think the second point here is it should come as no surprise to people that ministers make decisions. We provide advice, other parts of government provide advice, and all governments take advice from outside as well. And we see a lot of commentators and experts outside of government who are providing advice, and some of that advice is through formal channels like the groups that have been set up by, led by Sir Brian Roche and Sir David Skegg, have been set up explicitly to provide advice. And it's the role of governments, and particularly cabinet ministers, to look at all that advice and make decisions. So I don't think that's a surprising thing. That's actually how the system is supposed to work.
One of the things that you highlighted, though, was that the wider application would risk the trust the government has built in regards to the COVID-19 response. Do you see that as an issue? Do you think that more work needs to be done? Do you think the government is therefore being unnecessarily cautious to the detriment of that trust building?
But that advice around the concerns around trust was actually provided by DPMC. Our advice was the public health part of that overall advice that went to government. One of the things I think that's been really good to see is the ongoing very high level of trust and confidence of the public in our response. And arguably, I know some people have a slightly different view, but I think that our very high vaccination rates represent in large part the trust and confidence that people have in both the information that's been provided, in the way that the vaccine has been rolled out and delivered, and in the role it can play in our overall response. And to see rates of vaccination that I would have dreamed about earlier this year, and that I had very clear aspiration about. Everyone was trying to get me to come up with a figure, and I resisted it. But when I told my team here that it had a 9 in it, they felt really worried, because at that point they were planning on us achieving 70% coverage. But we've continued to just deliver, and New Zealanders have responded and shown trust and confidence in what I think is to a level that is not just I think demonstrating trust in the overall response, but shows that people understand the importance of vaccination, and it's serving us incredibly well.
On that, then going back to the treatments, one, do you guys have an indication or have been modelling about the percentage of the population who would probably need to use these treatments? And then secondary to that, there's been a lot of work obviously to inform the public about how important the vaccine is. Will there be a similar kind of means of communication around these treatments? Like, I can't even say half of the names. So how are we going to, tell people how important they are, but also what they even are, those sorts of things, and how much of the population would need it?
Yeah, you've done some modelling.
So the first part of your question around the modelling, that's exactly the work we have been doing, is because we need that number to work out how much we need to order for the population. So we've been looking at the modelling here, but we've also looked overseas. So for a good example is Ireland. We've found that the modelling there is actually quite similar to here. They've got high vaccination rates. The population density is quite similar, so we've actually been able to look at their numbers as well. So we've used that modelling very much to guide how much of the stock we need to order to start with. I think as regards sort of telling patients, I guess there's a balance, because I think our messaging has been quite clear even when we're announcing these treatments, that vaccination is still the best treatment. So what we don't want is people to think, I don't need to get a vaccine now because these treatments are available. Vaccination is still by far and away the best treatment, but this gives us some other things in our toolkit, particularly as we go into winter next year. But I think once we've got the final agreements landed, obviously we'll be putting out information to prescribers, the teams working in the community, because they'll need to have the knowledge of working out which medicine to use for which patients at which time. So that work is all still to happen. But I think we have to be very clear that we still want vaccination to be seen, and the booster campaign as well going into next year, that still is the number one protection for people.
Do you have a number based on the Ireland numbers, or in terms of like a New Zealand population, what can we expect?
Well, we've used those numbers to decide how much we've ordered. So we've ordered 60,000 courses of the Molnupiravir and 60,000 courses of the Pfizer Antiviral. So that gives us 120,000 treatment courses. So that's where we've landed to start with. But obviously there's the opportunity that we may be able to order more, but we wanted to make sure we had enough, really, based on the modelling information we had so far, to actually place a sort of reasonable order with the best of the knowledge we had at the moment.
Yeah, and our aspiration would be that we don't need all
of
it. And certainly we don't have to order more. As I say, that the most important way to protect people and stop them getting unwell is to stop them getting infected in the first place. So we'll be working hard to maintain that. Perhaps time for a couple more questions.
Dr. Bloomfield, in the vaccination rollout, your advice to Cabinet was for the Māori age band to be 15 years lower, and obviously Cabinet decided against that advice. Did that decision put Māori at greater risk of COVID-19?
We traversed this in quite some detail yesterday in the tribunal. I don't think that put Māori at greater risk, because what Cabinet was very focused on was ensuring that there was good access to Māori from early on for Māori to the vaccine from early on in the campaign. And there were a number of things that they put in place and authorised instead, and that we then rolled out through the program, including, as I talked about yesterday, those whānau-based approaches, the access to ring-fenced vaccine for Māori and Pacific providers. And we saw the benefit of that with those early high rates of vaccination amongst over 65s and amongst Māori and Pacific. And then, of course, the investment in our whole order providers to make sure that they were able to be out there vaccinating populations right from early on, but especially once the age range was sort of, or the vaccine supply meant we could open up to all age ranges, and there's been a huge effort that's gone in. So I would also say that fundamental to our response has been an understanding that if we let this virus get away in the community, the communities that would be hit hardest, and we've seen this even in Auckland, would be our Māori and Pacifica communities. So actually the whole elimination strategy and then our very tight suppression and protection approach under the new COVID protection framework has been absolutely driven by that equity understanding, and that's been driven by the government.
Dr. Bloomfield, can you talk a bit about MIH's decision to release Māori vaccination data to whānau ora, and why they decided to do that, and why it took so long?
Yes, so just written to Mr Tamahiri yesterday again following the latest High Court decision on this and guidance to really outline the decision around the release of the final tranche of data. And I would say that this third communication and this latest release did have a particular issue that I needed to give really careful thought to, in that there were several rohi around the North Island where iwi had made it clear that their view was that they didn't want data for their iwi members to be shared with the whānau ora collective. So rightly, I think we had to go through a good process to be able to fulfil the expectations of us under Te Tiriti, to engage with iwi locally as well as our Māori providers and in discussion with the whānau ora collective. However, the court had given a fairly clear directive in its most recent judgment, so I needed to make sure that those iwi were aware that I was now releasing the data, and that data is on unvaccinated Māori in those areas, and it is expressly for the purpose of the whānau ora collective being able to follow up Māori who either haven't had a first vaccine or whose second vaccine has been delayed somewhat. And it's expressly for that purpose. And then working with, and I've asked that the whānau ora collective work with iwi and other providers on the ground in that follow-up process and in the delivery of the vaccination. So I'm looking forward to seeing that pay dividends and getting our vaccination rates up even further.
What was the response of the iwi who didn't want their data shared when you contacted them after?
Well, I haven't heard back from them yet, but I have spoken to iwi throughout this, and yes, they have made it clear that there was a tension here where there were iwi, many iwi were comfortable with the data being shared, and so those are the data that we shared very promptly once we had been through that discussion. For the iwi that weren't so enthusiastic about it, I wanted to make sure that we did go through a due process and, to the best of our ability, listened to their concerns. But also for many of them, they wanted to receive the data themselves too, so that they could follow up with their iwi members, and we facilitated that as well. Good. Perhaps one last question. I'm getting a nod from my team here.
Given the borders are opening next year,
yes,
technically it's January, we're hearing that there's not yet been a clear specification for what happens, for example, for Australians who are coming over in terms of the isolation process when they get here. Do they need to book a motel, or, for example, if someone is going to Gisborne, are they allowed to isolate at home there upon arrival? What's the plan?
The plan is all being worked through, and the detail will be made available as soon as it's been signed off by cabinet ministers. In fact, by ministers, which will be very soon. But there will be. But the intention is as described, and that is that people can self-isolate, and that for many, and remembering that those who can travel back have to be New Zealand citizens or residents or partners of or family of, so they will have the vast majority of them will have a place to go to here, and yes, they will be able to travel to that place, but there will be expectations on them, including testing requirements, and those are all being finalised and they'll be publicised in due course, but that will be a topic for another discussion. Thank you very much for coming up today. It's been good.
Ask one more, Dr. Bloomfield. We've had reports of a 38-year-old Māori man dying from COVID. Are you aware of that?
I can't confirm anything, but the statement will be coming out shortly after this, and that will include any new deaths there might have been, as well as our case numbers and so on and so forth, and numbers in hospital. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, for joining from Christchurch.